The acrid smell of rain-soaked cardboard clung to Miguel's clothes as he counted his earnings for the day, $7.43. Not enough for a real meal, but enough to quiet the gnawing in his stomach for another night. At 14, he'd learned that survival wasn't about grand dreams or fairy tales, it was about making it through one more day on these unforgiving streets. Yet even as hunger carved hollow spaces inside him, Miguel couldn't ignore the sound that had haunted him all week. The quiet sobbing of a boy who sat alone in the shadowed alcove of the abandoned bakery, a boy whose eyes never seemed to find the light. The other street kids warned Miguel to mind his own business. Everyone had their struggles, their demons, their crosses to bear. But something about this boy was different. He was clean despite the grime of the streets, his clothes expensive though now torn and dirty, and his hands. Those hands trembled not from cold but from fear. From a loneliness so profound it seemed to echo in the empty spaces between the buildings. "You gonna just stand there staring, are you gonna say something?" The boy called out, his voice brittle as old glass. Miguel startled, stepping closer. "I didn't mean to, I just... How did you know I was here?" A bitter laugh escaped the boy's lips. "I'm blind, not deaf. Your shoes squeak when you walk. You've been checking on me every day for a week now. What do you want?" "Nothing," Miguel said, surprising himself with the truth. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." The boy's face crumpled, and for a moment, he looked even younger than Miguel. "I'm not okay. I haven't been okay since the accident. Since everything went dark. Since my mom died and I ran away from everything." Miguel sat down beside him, close enough to offer comfort but far enough to respect boundaries. "What's your name?" "David. And before you ask, yes, I know I'm an idiot for ending up on the streets when I could have just stayed in some group home or foster care. But you don't understand what it's like to wake up one day and have everything taken from you, your sight, your mother, your whole world. I couldn't stay in that place. They looked at me like I was broken. Like I was nothing." Over the following weeks, an unlikely friendship bloomed between the two boys like a stubborn flower pushing through concrete. Miguel shared his meager earnings, teaching David how to navigate the streets without sight. He described the world in vivid detail, the way the sunset painted the sky in layers of orange and purple, how the street vendors' faces crinkled when they laughed, the dance of pigeons fighting over bread crumbs. In return, David shared stories of a life Miguel could barely imagine: piano lessons, summer homes, private schools. "My father was wealthy," David admitted one evening as they huddled beneath a highway overpass, sharing a single blanket against the autumn chill. "Probably still is, but after Mom died, he just disappeared into his work. Into his grief. I became invisible to him even before I lost my sight. When the accident happened, when the drunk driver took everything, he couldn't even look at me. Maybe that's why I ran. Hard to miss someone who's already a ghost." Miguel felt anger kindle in his chest. "That's not right. You're his son." "Was," David corrected softly. "I was his son. Now I'm just a reminder of everything he lost." But Miguel refused to accept this. He'd grown up with nothing. No father, a mother who'd succumbed to addiction when he was 9, a system that shuffled him through foster homes like a deck of worn cards until he'd finally run to the streets seeking something resembling freedom. Yet even with nothing, he'd never lost his capacity to hope, to care, to believe that people deserved better than what life dealt them. When David developed a persistent cough that rattled his thin chest, Miguel made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He'd heard whispers about Dr. Chen, a retired surgeon who ran a free clinic on the east side, someone who asked no questions and turned no one away. It took 2 days of walking, of supporting David's weakening body, of using every penny Miguel had saved for bus fare when David could walk no further. Dr. Chen was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering to turn away from more. She examined David with gentle hands, her expression growing grave as she checked his chest, looked into his sightless eyes, asked careful questions about his medical history. "This boy needs proper care," she said finally, her accented English soft but firm. "The cough is pneumonia, treatable, but he needs antibiotics, rest, nutrition. And his eyes." She paused, studying David's face with an intensity that made Miguel's heart pound. "His blindness may not be permanent." The words hung in the air like a prayer. "What?" David's voice cracked. "What do you mean? Your medical history. The accident was 6 months ago, yes. And the blindness came from trauma, from swelling in the brain. Sometimes, with the right surgery, with the right intervention, sight can be restored. But it requires specialists, hospitals, money. How much? Miguel interrupted, his mind already racing through impossible calculations. Doctor. Chen's expression was kind but realistic. More than you have, child. More than I have. We're talking about neurosurgery, perhaps multiple procedures. $50,000. Maybe more. Miguel felt the number crush him like a physical weight. It might as well have been 50 million. But as he looked at David's face, at the trembling hope warring with resignation, he knew he couldn't give up. Not when there was even the smallest chance. The next morning, while David rested in the clinic's small recovery room fighting the pneumonia with antibiotics drive, Chen provided from her own limited supplies, Miguel made copies of his story at a public library. He'd spent the entire night writing out David's history, their friendship, the possibility of restored sight. He included drive, Chen's contact information, a plea for help, and a promise that every donated penny would go directly to David's medical care. Then he did something he'd never done before. He begged. Not just for spare change, but for attention, for compassion, for the miracle that David deserved. He stood on busy corners with his handwritten signs, his voice growing hoarse as he told their story to anyone who would listen. Most people rushed past, some sneered. A few dropped dollar bills into his cup with pitying looks that stung worse than their indifference. But on the third day, as Miguel's voice was failing and despair was creeping in like the evening shadows, a man stopped. He was middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Miguel would see in a year. But it was his eyes that caught Miguel's attention, eyes haunted by a grief so profound it seemed to hollow him from within. "Tell me again," the man said quietly. "About your friend. About the accident." Miguel told the story, watching something crack in the man's carefully constructed facade. When he finished, the man's hands were shaking. 6 months ago, a drunk driver. His mother died in the accident. Each question came out strangled. What was his mother's name? "I don't know," Miguel admitted. "He doesn't talk much about Catherine," the man whispered. "His name is David. David Morrison. And I'm his father." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Miguel stared at this man who was both stranger and salvation, trying to reconcile David's stories of neglect with the anguish now written across his face. "You're his father." "But he said." "I know what he said. I know what I did." Richard Morrison's voice broke. "When we lost Catherine, when David lost his sight, I couldn't. I was drowning in grief, and instead of being his father, instead of holding him together, I fell apart. I worked 18-hour days to avoid going home to the silence. To avoid seeing his empty eyes that reminded me so much of hers. And when he disappeared, when he ran away, I told myself it was what he wanted. That he was better off without a father too broken to function." Tears streaked down his face. "But I've been looking for him. God help me. Every day I've been looking, hiring investigators, checking every hospital and shelter. I just never thought to look here." What happened next moved with the swift inevitability of a storm breaking. Richard Morrison took Miguel and David to the best hospital in the city. The medical team that assembled read like a who's who of specialists, neurologists, ophthalmologists, surgeons whose expertise came with price tags that made Miguel dizzy. But Richard never flinched at the costs. This was his son, his second chance, and money had never meant less than it did in those critical days. The surgery took 11 hours. Miguel waited in the hospital corridor, refusing to leave despite having no official place there. Richard sat beside him, two souls bound by their love for a boy who'd been lost and was now, perhaps, being found in more ways than one. When David finally woke 3 days later, his eyes were bandaged. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic but made no promises. Brain injuries were unpredictable. Sometimes hope was just another form of heartbreak. The day they removed the bandages, Miguel held his breath. Richard gripped his son's hand, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. David's eyes, those eyes that had seen nothing but darkness for half a year, blinked against the light. "Dad," the word came out uncertain, a question and an answer all at once. "I'm here, son. I'm here, and I'm never leaving again." But David's gaze swept past his father, searching, until it found Miguel standing awkwardly by the door, ready to slip away into the anonymity he'd always known. "Miguel," David breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "I can see you. You're real." Miguel tried to speak, but his throat was too tight. He'd never thought about what David would see when he finally looked at him, a scrawny street kid with second-hand clothes and no future worth mentioning. But David was smiling like Miguel was the sunrise after endless night. Richard Morrison looked between the two boys, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You saved my son," he said to Miguel. "Not just his sight, his life, his soul. When I'd given up, when David had given up, you refused to let him disappear. How can I ever repay that?" Miguel shook his head. "I didn't do it for payment. David's my friend. You don't keep score with people you care about." But Richard Morrison was a man who'd built an empire by solving problems, by taking action. Within a week, he'd established a foundation in his late wife's name dedicated to helping homeless youth. Miguel became not just its inspiration but its voice, sharing his story to help others still living in the shadows. Richard offered him something more precious than money: a home, an education, a future that extended beyond the next meal or the next night's shelter. 2 years later, Miguel stood in the auditorium of his new high school, preparing to give a speech about the power of compassion. David sat in the front row, his restored vision allowing him to watch his best friend with pride. Richard Morrison was there too, a man transformed by loss and redemption, who'd learned that wealth meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. "I used to think kindness was a luxury," Miguel began, his voice steady despite the crowd. "Something you could only afford when you had enough for yourself first. But I learned something on the streets, something a blind boy taught me when he couldn't see but somehow saw me clearer than anyone ever had. Kindness isn't about what you have. It's about who you are. It's about recognizing yourself in someone else's struggle and refusing to look away." He paused, his eyes finding David's. "My friend David didn't need me to be rich or powerful to save him. He needed me to care enough to try. And in trying to help him, in refusing to accept that darkness was forever, I ended up saving myself too. Because here's the truth nobody tells you: when you help someone else find their light, you illuminate your own path forward." As applause filled the auditorium, Miguel thought about that rain-soaked evening when he'd first heard David crying in the shadows. He'd been a street kid with nothing but $7.43, unaware that the blind boy he was about to help had a millionaire father searching desperately for him. He'd had no idea that his small act of caring would ripple outward, transforming lives, creating futures where only darkness had existed before. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the most powerful changes always started with someone who saw another person's pain and decided it mattered. Someone who chose compassion when indifference would have been easier. Someone who proved that the most valuable currency wasn't money. It was the courage to care when caring cost you something, and the wisdom to recognize that in helping others rise, you lifted yourself as well. In the end, Miguel didn't cure David's blindness, doctors did that. But he'd done something even more miraculous. He'd refused to let either of them remain invisible, and in that refusal, he'd illuminated a path forward for them both. From the streets to salvation, from darkness to light, their story became a testament to a simple truth: that sometimes the richest gift we can offer costs nothing at all. It simply requires us to see each other, truly see each other, and choose compassion over convenience, connection over indifference, hope over despair. And in that choice lies the power to change not just one future, but all of ours.